How do you keep a YouTube viewer in suspense? I'll tell you later. Yes, today on Dragon's Teeth, we're looking at building tension in our games. Hi, how's it going? I'm Rob Poyton. Thanks for joining me. Yes, today on Dragon's Teeth, we're continuing our look at RPGs in particular, and today's topic is how we build tension. Now, this is going to cross over a little bit with the previous upload on building atmosphere, because of course, building a good atmosphere in and of itself will create some tension. We think of spooky sound effects or creepy music or dramatic music, that kind of thing. But we're going to delve a little more into some other aspects, particularly looking at this idea of ratcheting up the tension, mainly for RPGs, but of course some of these will apply to tabletop games as well, whether they be skirmish games or huge recreations of the Battle of Waterloo or whatever it is. In fact, there's a prime example. I'll get onto that in a moment. And I'm dividing this topic of tension up appropriately enough into the T's. And the first T we're going to start with is tone. Now, of course, as we've mentioned before, and particularly in the How to Be a Better GM upload, your tone of voice is very important when relaying information to your players. If it's a dull monotone constantly throughout the whole thing, then people are going to phase out. By the same token, you don't want to be everything to be breakneck, shouting at your players up all the time. We need to modulate the tone according to the situation. So with tension, that can go two ways. It can be very fast. You run down the corridor, you open the door, there's four orcs standing there. One's pulling a bow, he's aiming at you. What are you going to do? So you can have that kind of rushed action feeling, if you like. But tension can also come through something like you're in an old house. The wind howls through the rafters. You hear the creak and bang of a shutter from an open window. Bang! 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 And then it stops. So either of those things can create an element of tension because, of course, tension comes in all shapes and sizes. Alongside that, we can think of the general tone of the game. And usually, not always, people know what they're playing before they join in. We know it's going to be a Call of Cthulhu scenario. We know it's going to be a Mothership scenario, D&D, whatever it is. So people will bring probably an expectation with them in any case. And the tone of your game you can set if you have a session 0, of course, where you discuss that, and you also give players the tools to signal that they're not comfortable, perhaps, with the tone or the tension or what is happening. But this is where you lay out your stall, so to speak. Now, that's not to say you can't throw a 180. I think of something like Watership Down, perhaps. And of course, there was a game called Bunnies and Burrows. We're going to play rabbits, and we're having a lovely time bouncing around the field, and you maybe have to gather some food and then dig a burrow, that kind of thing. It can all be very nice. I believe there's a genre of computer games now called cozy games, I think, where this is the kind of thing you do. Now, if you were a nasty evil GM, which, let's be honest, most of us are, you allow that to go on, then all of a sudden, 3 feral dogs come rushing into the scene. Straight away, we've got instant tension and possibly carnage. Your players may not like that, though, so do check beforehand, of course. You know, we want to surprise players sometimes, maybe shock them a little bit, but we certainly don't want to upset them. So you set a tone, but that tone can shift in much the same way your voice will shift between dry descriptions, action descriptions of, as we've already discussed, and so on. The other thing I like to do, which adds an element of, I suppose realism might be a word and can increase the tension, is what I call preloading the players. So what I do quite a lot in my Mothership campaign, for example, I know we've got something coming up. So there might be a specific bit of kit that is going to be discovered. Rather than when that is discovered, say, oh, you find X, Y, and Z. I'll preload the player beforehand. I'll send them a private message before we start, and I'll say something like, at this prompt, your character can say, oh, I've just found a new Bitron interface module. This is actually the version 3. It has the extended range and everything. So it's coming from the player rather than from me. Now, this generally helps, as I said, in the overall feel of the game, but of course we can use that to increase tension as well. If rather than me say, can someone hear a tapping on the side of the wall there? If you preload one of the players to say that, then I find it has a little bit more impact. Our next T is time. And this goes back to the Battle of Waterloo I mentioned, where of course, give me Blucher or give me knights. Wellington was really waiting for Blucher's army to turn up to assure his victory. And, it was a close run thing by all accounts. So putting a time element into any game, whether it's tabletop or role play, will increase the tension. Now, the scale of time and how you present it can vary according to the needs of the scenario, of course. It could be the old traditional James Bond countdown. You've got to defuse an explosive device, and at the moment it's at 60, 59, 58, and so on. So a very visible kind of counter thing going on. It doesn't necessarily have to relate to time as such. So the players could find themselves trapped in a room that is slowly filling with water. So there's an indication of the time, you like, but that is also the actual danger as well. And of course, that might be extended. You might have 2 weeks to complete a mission. You might have 48 hours to find a missing person, that kind of thing. These are very easy things to build into the scenario in order to increase tension. Time also incorporates the aspect of timing, because we all know the secret of good humour is timing, of course. The same applies for good tension. If it's relentless from start to finish, then again, people will tend to zone out a little bit. We need peaks and troughs. Like in any drama or film or any sort of storytelling, we have to have this up and down, this variation in pace or action or tone, whatever you want to call it. And sometimes you might have a setting that creates a deal of tension at first, but if you extend it too much, that tension can wear off. I was listening recently to the good friends of Jackson Elias, talking particularly about things like the back rooms, which are incredibly creepy. If you've not seen them, do go and check it out on YouTube. But in game terms, the first 5 or 10 minutes is full of tension. After a while, if the place is empty, then it just becomes, oh, another empty room, another empty room, another empty room. The tension can deflate rather quickly if you're not careful. Of course, this is the point where, just as they're on the cusp of going, oh, it's another empty room, this is where you put in your irregular tapping through the wall or whatever it is to suddenly boost that tension level up again. This relates in a way to something called flow state, which I teach a lot in my martial arts and my health and fitness training. Now, this is a huge subject in itself. If you're interested, I would advise you Google it. But one of the requirements of flow state, getting in the zone, being in the moment, is whatever you're doing has to be challenging in some way, but not too challenging and not too easy. If something is very easy, if we're doing a simple action, it becomes robotic. The mind wanders off. If something is so hard as to be virtually impossible, then again, we're going to shut down mentally. After we decide that no, that's actually impossible, we kind of give up on it. So it's a little bit the same with tension. You want to keep that level there. Sometimes underline, turn the volume up a bit, then bring it down. But there's always that slight edge to what is going on in order to keep the players interested. If we look at some of the best horror writers, I'm thinking particularly of M.R. James, H.P. Lovecraft. Ramsey Campbell is a master of this as well. The way they do it is you start off with everything very normal. It's just a normal day. Oh, what's this? I found an old book in my late uncle's possessions. Let's have a flick through that. Suddenly things start to change, but very subtle at first. There's an odd shadow in the corner. You think there's someone standing on the other side of the field looking at you. And of course, this builds and builds as the story develops. So if you want some good tips on building terror in that way, then do, of course, check out those authors if you haven't already. The other way you can bring tension into this idea of time is through resource management as well. And for me, the supreme example of this in what could potentially be quite a dry sort of naval game in space is Starfleet battles, because there you have to allocate your resources. You might have 35 points of power from your warp engines. Every turn you have to balance that. You need power for movement, you need power for life support, for your shields, for probes, to rearm your weapons, etc., etc. And there's never quite enough. You have to make a decision. Are we going to reinforce the front shield, or are we going to charge up the photon torpedoes? And the way that is then played out over 32 impulses in a turn makes for some very nail-biting decisions and rolls of the dice. Now, to some extent, we can mirror that in RPGs because, of course, the players have access to resources in their particular world. If they have too much, this is one of the dangers with sci-fi, and I guess with magic as well. If a magician can go, oh, there's 3 red dragons coming at us, boom, there we go, they've disappeared, then the tension kind of evaporates. Unless you say, well, you're going to have to roll the dice for that, and we're going to add in this factor and that factor, maybe that changes a little bit. In sci-fi terms, everyone's got all this kit. We've got this that can pick up radio waves, we've got personal radar, we've got pulse rifles. Okay, so you might limit that, or you do the Mothership special is, yeah, you've picked up the pulse rifle, but the energy pack has drained. So you maybe got one shot if you're lucky. And all the xenomorphs are now charging at you. What you're going to do? So by all means, allow players access to resources, but either limit them in some way or make them a little less than optimal. And of course, to build tension, we need to have the next T, which is threat. The threat needs to be significant and important to the players. Sometimes that's very obvious. A big creature is running at you. The threat is right there in your face, physically, literally. So that is one thing. But we can think about other threats as well. One of the reason I think sci-fi games are very easy to ratchet up the tension, it's like being on a submarine. Okay, there's that expression. I don't know if it was submarines or from something else about, but yeah, a submarine tour is like 6 weeks of unrelieved boredom, then 10 minutes of absolute terror because you're in this little tube. Something goes wrong, that's it. Obviously, if you're on a spaceship, it's the same idea. There's this sort of 2-inch sheet of metal or whatever it is protecting you from the endless, boundless cosmos that wants nothing more than your demise. So that in itself creates tension. And then you're not necessarily getting that physical, I'm being attacked tension, but things like, why is that light flashing on the dashboard? I mean, I have this on the car, right? I've got an £800 Ford Fiesta. The little light starts flashing. Oh, God, what does that mean? On a spaceship, imagine how much more terrifying that is. So, very easy little things to add in. And again, it might just be that the oil filter needs changing or whatever. It doesn't have to be something catastrophic. Or those little things can build to make something catastrophic. That, of course, also brings our time element because they're generally going to be up against the clock to fix it before it becomes a real issue. Now, when it comes to NPCs, of course, these add into our tension mix. We have adversaries, we have allies, we have people we're not sure who they are, which side they're on. We might have an old nemesis or an arch villain thrown in. that kind of thing. How you incorporate these into your campaign, because we're talking more campaign now rather than a one shot, can lead to many moments of tension. But you have to build this relationship, and I'd advise you start doing that very early on. I just put up the last session of the Mothership campaign, Club Nebula, where the party, without going too much into spoilers, well, if you watch it, you'll find out, the party find a severed ear of a chap called Craig Wu outside a nightclub they're investigating. He has this particular piece of tech in his ear that records things. That's his thing. Anyway, they find his severed ear. Now, part of the intention of that scenario is they then go in and rescue him. I had put Craig in the campaign from the start, but maybe I didn't build a strong enough attachment. They've met him a few times because the party sort of said, "Oh, that must be Craig Woo's ear. We recognise that bit of tech. Oh, I hope he's going to be okay." And then started doing something else. As it happens, they got into the club anyway, but I don't think poor old Craig was their primary purpose for doing that. So the stronger you can build these connections early on, then the better. Then again, it feels more realistic when something happens to this person. It's not just, the typical, oh, so-and-so has died and you've inherited his house, blah, blah, blah. If there is a relationship already, then again, you will have more impact with your tension. And this, of course, is where you have the idea of threat to the players, but also threat to people they know. Most characters are going to have a family of some sort. Maybe you get a phone call from your brother. Oh, our sister's gone missing. You can weave all of these things in to help with that tension. With the threat as well, it's quite interesting if you present threats. Obviously, some things are black and white. Something's charging towards you. You've got to deal with it. But it's nice to create other threats or other types of tension where the players are forced to make difficult decisions. Right, if I do this, I'm going to save the ship, but the people on the planet below are going to be killed. There's quite a few situations where you can think of this. It's not difficult to start thinking of that. So you give them a difficult choice, but then also perhaps the ideas of moral ambiguity as well. If you've got a despotic tyrant, a real bad person in your campaign, maybe there's a time travel element. Do the characters get the chance to go back in time and see him as a kid? What do they do? Are they going to save the lives of millions in the future by harming a child, for example? So a lot of these things are not direct threats as such, but they do create this question of choice and moral tension in the players as well. And the final T is theatre. Now, of course, if we're working in another medium such as film, building tension is easier in some ways because we have the music, we control exactly what people are seeing. What they are seeing is depicted. They don't have to imagine anything. We get perhaps a first person view of going down the dark corridor and all the rest of it. The score builds, bang, we get the jump scare. Very easy to do that in film. In RPGs, especially if we're working with theatre of the mind, which we are primarily, that can be a little more of a challenge. As we said with building the atmosphere, it might be that we're able to put in sound effects, it might be that we can show pictures and maps and this kind of stuff, but it basically comes down to the descriptive powers of the game master. So this is something we can be aware of. And again, I'm not saying we have to stand and enunciate and this sort of thing, but think about how you present, how you voice NPCs and so on. And probably the single biggest moment of theatre or tension in most RPGs is rolling the dice. You need a 6 in order to save everyone. So milk these moments a little bit when they come. Obviously, potentially we're rolling dice quite a lot, depending on what sort of game you're playing. Mothership, there tends to be a lot less dice rolling. Something like D&D, there's a lot more, and all those things in between. So for your run-of-the-mill stuff, okay. But if it comes to one of those big moments, well, you've got to roll a 6 or the whole tower collapses, then don't rush into it, build it up a little bit, draw everyone in, and then boom, the dice roll goes. These are the moments that people will remember. And this again as well is where we should involve the players. It's not always down to the game master to describe what's going on. Say to the player, how does your character feel at this moment? You're about to throw this switch and you're not sure if it's going to blow up the sun or not. How are you feeling? So put that sort of emphasis and impetus back onto the player to describe. And then, well, how are you feel? How are you going to support him in this or her in this? You know, again, if you involve the players, you've got that character investment, but you start getting the player investment in the situation as well. And from that, we can just finish with the idea of the mechanics of tension as well, because different systems will approach this in different ways. Very obviously in Call of Cthulhu, we have sand loss. As you know more, your sanity decreases. So there's a slow burn tension, perhaps to the point where the character is going to collapse completely. We can think of stress and sanity in Mothership as well. The allocation of stress points is a very nice way of ratcheting tension. Again, you might approach that differently in a one-shot to a campaign, but I've spoken about that over on the Mothership channel. But that's a very nice and easy indicator of the stress level of the character. The player is informed in a way what their stress level is. They don't have to think about it too much themselves. And of course, the mechanic is then if you reach a certain level, you make a panic roll and all sorts of bad things can happen from there. So those are some mechanics that can be used, and as I say, most times we're using the dice and the dice roll, the threat of a bad dice roll, the threat of a fumble, all that kind of thing. But there are other things as well that I've seen, and I've not experienced these personally, so I'd be very interested to hear if you have and how they worked out. I can't remember the name of the game, but one is the Jenga tower. Rather than roll the dice, you have to take a brick out of the Jenga tower. Excellent, excellent. Another one, I think the game is called 10 Candles. And as things go on, you have 10 candles lit. That's your illumination. As the game goes on and the tension level rises or whatever happens, a candle is extinguished. A candle is extinguished. Again, a really lovely sort of visual and environmental way of putting tension into what can be quite an abstract pastime or pursuit. So there we are. I hope there's some ideas there. Of course, there's lots of other things we could discuss. That idea of creeping tension, that comes down to two things. It's either something is there that shouldn't be, or something isn't there that should be. Things that jar slightly. Perhaps the party are investigating an old abattoir and they find some tethered floating party balloons. You know, it's out of place. Could be something perfectly innocent. It could not. But, you know, it just adds that little bit of, oh, that's unusual, and there's your tension. I guess, you know, the clown is the go-to example for this, right? Kiddies entertainer and all the rest of it. Yeah, it's great at a party. It's not. It's never great. But the clown, as we had all those silly scares going a few years ago, someone in a clown suit hanging around the housing estate, um, you know, it scares people. It frightens people. So these are things that you can play with as well. And as I said, if you can get the players to take part in that as well, let them notice it rather than the game master notice it, then that really will help. All right, that's it today. Thanks very much for joining me. The Mothership campaign is still ongoing. The episodes are going up as I get time to edit them. It's quite a long process, but the next one will hopefully be up sort of next week or so. We may have one or two spaces opening up in that. So if you are interested in joining our online Mothership campaign, take a look at the playlist on the channel, then drop me a line if you'd like to get involved. As always, of course, I'm really happy to hear your ideas, feedback, your own experiences, any hints and tips that you've got. Greatly appreciated. And as always, if you haven't already, please do like, share and subscribe. Okay, I'm going to go and investigate a strange scratching noise at the other end of the room here. I'm sure it'll be fine. I'll see you next time. I hope.